On the wedding day, he humiliated her in front of everyone, but he never imagined how fate would. Emma Collins stood by the window of the ranch's bridal suite, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched a handwritten letter, the vows she'd spent nights perfecting. Outside, the golden fields of rural Ohio stretched endlessly, a sunlit dream wrapped in wildflowers and hay bales, the perfect place for a storybook wedding. This day was supposed to be the culmination of everything she believed in: love, loyalty, and new beginnings. She had chosen this ranch because it reminded her of the summers she spent with her grandparents. Simple, peaceful, and grounded, just like how she once believed her relationship with Ryan Mitchell to be. Ryan, a sharp-suited attorney from Chicago, had swept her off her feet 2 years ago during a medical fundraiser in Cleveland. She remembered the way he looked at her across the room, like no one else existed. Their love blossomed quickly but deeply. He appreciated her dedication to nursing, her calm resilience, and her ability to listen more than she spoke. And she admired his ambition, the way he carried himself, and how he seemed to always have a plan. Together, they dreamed of a life built on stability and mutual respect. Now, as guests gathered near the flower-draped arbor in the field, Emma took a shaky breath. The suite behind her was filled with chatter, bridesmaids making last-minute touches, her mother dabbing tears from her eyes, and her father adjusting his tie with nervous pride. But Emma's mind was elsewhere, tangled in the quiet doubts that had crept in during the past few weeks. Ryan had been distant lately, still present, but distracted. He had postponed a few wedding planning calls, skipped a family brunch with a vague excuse, and seemed on edge during their final meeting with the officiant. Emma had brushed those moments aside, attributing them to work stress or pre-wedding jitters. After all, they both had demanding lives, and it wasn't unusual for a groom to feel overwhelmed. But last night, during their final phone call before the big day, something in Ryan's voice had unsettled her. He had sounded formal, almost cold. She had ended the call feeling like she had just spoken to a stranger. Still, this morning she woke determined. Dressed in ivory silk and lace, hair pinned in soft curls, she looked every bit the glowing bride. Her father arrived at the suite exactly on time, and when he saw her, his eyes welled up instantly. "You look just like your mother on her wedding day," he whispered, his voice cracking. Emma clung to that warmth, needing it more than ever. The music began. The bridesmaids descended the aisle one by one. Then it was her turn. As she took her father's arm, the world around her seemed to blur. The crowd of familiar faces smiled and watched, phones and cameras held high. She searched the crowd for Ryan and finally saw him waiting under the arbor, hands clasped, face still and unreadable. Emma smiled automatically, her heartbeat loud in her ears. But Ryan didn't smile back. He looked at her, then quickly away, fixing his gaze on some distant point beyond the guests. Her steps slowed for a beat, just long enough for her father to squeeze her hand reassuringly. "You're okay," he murmured. But Emma wasn't sure. Her throat tightened and a knot formed in her stomach. She pushed through the doubt, reminding herself that this was their day. Nothing could ruin it. They had been through too much together. Late nights balancing schedules, family pressures, months apart during COVID lockdowns. All of it had only made them stronger, or so she had believed. As she reached the altar, the officiant smiled and welcomed the guests. Ryan barely moved. Emma took his hand, surprised to find it slightly cold and stiff. The ceremony began. The officiant spoke of love, commitment, and truth, the foundations of any lasting marriage. Then came the moment for personal vows. Emma turned to Ryan, her letter in hand. Her voice shook as she began, but she pressed on, speaking from the deepest parts of herself. She spoke of how Ryan had taught her to dream again, how he had given her a sense of safety she had never known. She talked about the little moments, the way he made coffee exactly how she liked it, how he never forgot to ask about her patients, and the time he stayed up all night to help her through a panic attack during finals. Her words were a tender tapestry of love and gratitude. She finished with a whisper, "You are my safe place, and today I choose you always." Then it was Ryan's turn. He didn't take out his vows. Instead, he paused, cleared his throat, and looked out at the guests. His jaw tightened. For a moment, Emma thought he might be fighting tears. But when he finally spoke, his voice was calm. Too calm. "I can't do this." A hushed gasp rippled through the crowd. Emma froze. Ryan stepped back slightly. "Really is. I can't marry someone who hasn't been honest about who she silence fell." Emma stared at him, uncomprehending. Her ears rang. A part of her wanted to believe this was some twisted joke, a terrible prank, but Ryan's expression was stone. He turned slightly to the audience. "There are things about Emma that I only recently found out, things she chose not to tell me. I loved her or thought I did, but I can't build a marriage on half-truths." Emma's heart thundered in her chest. Her mouth went dry. Around them, murmurs started, guests exchanging glances, some looking away in discomfort. Her father stepped forward instinctively, but Emma raised a hand to stop him. She felt exposed, humiliated, and deeply confused. What was he talking about? What secrets? What truths? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only the sound of the wind in the trees and the thudding silence of disbelief. And in that unbearable moment, something inside her broke. Emma's legs trembled beneath the soft layers of her gown. Her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her lips. She had dreamt of this day countless times, rehearsing every detail in her mind. The walk down the aisle, the way Ryan would smile at her with the look he always gave when he was overwhelmed by love, the vows they would exchange with tears in their eyes. But nothing in her dreams, in her memories, or in her fears had prepared her for this. She looked directly at Ryan, hoping to find some explanation in his face. But there was no apology there, no hesitation, not even anger, just distance. His eyes were colder than the wind that passed through the open field. A silence heavier than grief settled over the gathering. The officiant, stunned and unsure of what to do, lowered the booklet he had been holding. Emma's father stood frozen, jaw clenched as he looked from Ryan to his daughter. Someone in the crowd coughed. A child asked too loudly what had just happened, but the only thing Emma could hear was the deafening beat of her own heart. She felt every pair of eyes fixed on her. Friends, family, colleagues, strangers from Ryan's side. Faces once filled with joy, now distorted by shock and disbelief. Emma instinctively took a step back, her body moving before her mind could catch up. She wasn't crying yet. Not because it didn't hurt, it did, in ways she couldn't even describe, but because she was still trying to process if this was real. Ryan shifted slightly, hands still clasped in front of him. He didn't reach for her, didn't offer an explanation beyond the vague accusation he had just thrown into the wind. His silence was a blade as sharp as his words. Emma turned toward the guests, as if trying to understand whether anyone else could make sense of what had just happened. But all she saw were confused expressions and a few cell phones already raised, capturing what was becoming a train wreck in slow motion. The whispers started. A murmur from the back, a quiet gasp from someone who knew them in college. Emma's mother, seated in the front row, reached for her husband's hand. The bridesmaids exchanged glances, torn between rushing to Emma's side or staying still to avoid making the scene worse. The photographer, visibly uncomfortable, slowly lowered the camera, unsure whether to keep shooting or stop entirely. Emma turned to Ryan again, her voice barely above a whisper, but enough for the microphone near the altar to pick up. "What are you talking about?" she asked. "What truths?" Ryan didn't answer right away. His jaw flexed, and for a brief moment, he looked at her, not as a man in love, but as someone delivering a verdict. "You never told me everything," he said, still calm, too calm. "You made me believe I knew you, but I didn't. You hid parts of your life, important parts. And I can't start a marriage with someone who chooses to lie by omission." His words stung more than any outright accusation. Emma's mind raced, trying to pinpoint what he was referring to. She had always been open with him, hadn't she? She thought back to every conversation, every deep talk they had shared over wine on her porch. Every Sunday morning in bed where they had discussed their dreams, their childhoods, their pasts. What had she hidden? Still, there was no time to answer that question. The moment had collapsed into itself. The ceremony was no longer a wedding. It was a spectacle. "I'm sorry," Ryan added. as if those two words could glue back together everything he had just shattered. He turned to the officiant, gave a small nod and stepped away from the altar. Just like that. Emma stood alone. A strange noise escaped her lips. Not quite a sob, not quite a breath. Her hands dropped to her sides, the crumpled paper of her vows slipping between her fingers and falling onto the grass. She looked at it for a second, then back up at the crowd, her vision beginning to blur. Her father took a step forward again, finally breaking the invisible barrier of paralysis that had gripped him. He placed a steadying hand on her back, but Emma gently pulled away. Without saying a word, she gathered the front of her gown, turned around and walked back down the aisle. Not the way she had planned, not as a bride beside the man she loved, but as a woman who had just been left behind in front of everyone she knew. No music played this time. No one dared speak. The guests parted like water around her, their silence worse than judgment. As Emma passed each row, she saw faces she loved. Her cousin Anna, who had flown in from Texas, her high school teacher, who had always believed in her, her grandmother, who was already beginning to cry. And in every face there was a shared, unbearable pain. The pain of watching someone you love be broken in real time. She reached the edge of the field, still not crying, still not speaking. A single journalist, there to cover the high-profile wedding for a local magazine, snapped a photo. That photo would circulate within hours. By the time Emma reached the ranch house again, the first wave of shock began to break inside her. Her hands shook as she opened the door, pulling herself into the solitude of the bridal suite. The room was just as she had left it. Flowers on the vanity, champagne flutes half full, a card from Ryan resting on the mirror. She walked straight to the card and stared at it. On the outside, in his handwriting, it read, "For the woman I want forever." She didn't open it. Instead, she sat on the edge of the bed and let her body collapse forward. The tears came, then not in delicate streams, but in wrenching sobs that bent her double. The sounds of the world outside, the guests, the whispers, the unanswered questions, faded into the background. In that room, she was no longer a bride. She was a woman, trying to breathe through heartbreak. She didn't know how long she sat there, minutes, maybe an hour, but eventually there was a knock at the door. Her best friend, Lily, stepped in quietly, her eyes red, her hands gentle. She said nothing, just sat beside Emma and wrapped her arms around her. It was the kind of silence that didn't ask for explanations, just presence. Emma leaned into the hug, her voice hoarse when she finally spoke. "What did I do wrong?" Lily shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered. "Absolutely nothing." But Emma didn't believe it. Not yet. Not while the image of Ryan's face still haunted her, not while the unanswered accusation hung in the air like smoke. Her heart, which once beat with hope and promise, now throbbed with questions, the kind that would not leave her alone for a long time. And somewhere outside, in the soft light of a ruined afternoon, the wedding decorations fluttered in the wind, as if mourning the ceremony that never was. The sun had not yet set, but the day already felt like a memory Emma would spend years trying to forget. Inside the bridal suite, the lights remained dim, the air stale with perfume and wilted flowers. Emma sat in the same spot on the bed, her body unmoving, as if frozen in time. Her gown, now wrinkled and marked with grass stains at the hem, hung around her like a forgotten curtain on an abandoned stage. The silence between her and Lily had stretched, heavy and necessary, like a bandage not yet ready to be removed. Outside, the guests had begun to disperse, some retreating in awkward silence, others speaking in hushed tones. Nobody knew what had just happened with certainty, but theories had already started to form. Emma knew how quickly whispers became headlines, and how easily speculation could morph into a version of the truth that had never existed. The knock at the door returned, firmer this time. Lily looked toward it but waited for Emma's cue. Emma didn't speak, only nodded slightly. Lily opened it just enough to reveal Emma's older cousin, Michelle, who stepped inside holding Emma's small clutch and a soft shawl. Her eyes, always perceptive, scanned the room and the state of the bride, then softened. "He's still here," Michelle said. "No. He's talking to his parents and a few others." I thought you should. Emma didn't respond. Her fingers slowly traced the embroidery on the shawl now draped over her shoulders. Michelle waited a beat longer, then added, "He said more after you walked away." I stayed and listened. That made Emma look up, eyes red but focused. "What did he say?" Michelle hesitated, pulling up a chair and sitting directly across from her. "He tried to clarify things. He said there were things about your past you never told him, something about not being able to trust someone who wasn't fully honest. But he didn't give details. It was all vague, enough to make people doubt, not enough to understand." Emma's throat tightened. She could feel the sting of tears again but held them back. "He didn't even let me speak. He just stood there and decided that was enough, that I wasn't enough." Lily spoke up, voice calm but firm, looking for a way out. "That's because he wasn't looking for answers. He was," Michelle nodded solemnly. "He didn't look like someone making a brave choice. He looked like someone trying to convince himself he hadn't just made the worst decision of his life." Emma rose slowly, the weight of the gown making every movement deliberate. She walked to the mirror, her reflection almost unrecognizable. Mascara streaks painted her cheeks, her lipstick long gone, and her eyes, once filled with excitement, now mirrored only disbelief. "I don't understand," she whispered. "I was honest. I never hid anything to hurt him. I thought we were building something real." Lily crossed the room, placing a hand gently on Emma's back. "Go now, you don't owe anyone here anything. Do you want to leave? We can..." Emma nodded slowly. "Thinks I did. Not yet. I need to hear it. From him. I need to know what exactly he outside the ranch was quieter now. Many guests had left, the remaining few standing in small groups near parked cars or under the event tent, still trying to process the day's chaos. The decor, so meticulously arranged earlier, now felt like a ghost town carnival. Petals scattered across the aisle, chairs askew, champagne flutes untouched. Emma walked out of the bridal suite without fanfare, holding up the front of her dress to avoid tripping. Lily and Michelle flanked her, silent sentinels. Heads turned as she passed, and the crowd parted once more, this time not for a bride, but for a woman determined to confront her truth. She found Ryan near the tent, speaking to his mother and Omi, a couple of guests. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his hair disheveled. When he saw her approaching, he straightened instinctively, as if trying to reclaim some authority he'd long lost. Emma didn't stop until she stood a few feet from him, her voice steady, though her body was shaking. "Tell me," she said, "what do you think I lied about?" Ryan glanced at the people around them, suddenly aware of the attention. Emma didn't care. She wasn't going to let him retreat behind vague accusations and wounded pride. Not anymore. He exhaled sharply, then gestured toward the side of the tent. "Can we talk privately?" "No," Emma said, her tone sharper. "You made this public. You humiliated me in front of everyone I care about. You don't get to hide behind privacy now." Ryan ran a hand through his hair, frustration flashing across his face. "I found out about your brother." Emma stared at him, waiting. "I didn't know you had custody of him, that you raised him for a while, that your mom had issues." He paused, as if expecting her to explain or defend herself. "You never told me." "I didn't hide him," Emma said, her voice low. "I told you about Ethan. You met him. I just didn't go into the details of that time in my life because it's complicated and painful, and we were building something new. I never lied." "You omitted it," he snapped, decided not to share. "And it matters. It matters because I don't know what else you've..." Emma blinked. "You think because I didn't give you a full autobiography, I'm not trustworthy. I'm saying I deserve to know, before standing at the altar." I needed to. Ryan's jaw clenched. "Know everything." "You needed to trust me," Emma replied. "That's what love is. I trusted you with my heart. And instead of asking me, instead of having one honest conversation, you waited until our wedding day to punish me for something you didn't understand." The air between them grew heavy. People around them pretended not to listen, but everyone heard. Emma didn't care. Her voice didn't tremble anymore. "So you didn't just break my heart today, Ryan. You made sure I couldn't pick up the pieces without an audience." He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was nothing left to say. Emma turned and walked away, her spine straight, her steps, "Sure." The whispers followed her, but she didn't flinch. Behind her, Ryan remained standing, surrounded by silence and stares. She had come looking for answers, but all she found was confirmation. Confirmation that the man she was going to marry had never truly seen her, had never truly listened, had never truly loved her, not in the way she deserved. Inside the suite, once more Emma sat by the window and watched as the last of the guests drove away. Dusk settled over the ranch, the sky painted in muted shades of purple and gray. Lily handed her a cup of tea. Michelle began packing her things. No one spoke. There was nothing left to say. Emma sipped the tea and let her eyes close just for a moment. She was exhausted, hollow, but somewhere inside her, a new resolve was forming. Something had broken, yes, but something else had begun. A question no longer lingered in her mind. She had done nothing wrong, and with that certainty came the faintest flicker of strength. The morning after what should have been her wedding, Emma left before dawn. The rented SUV sat packed and ready in the gravel driveway, the engine still humming as the horizon turned slowly from black to gray. She hadn't slept. She had sat through the night in silence, sometimes staring at the blank walls of the bridal suite, sometimes at her phone as notifications kept flooding in, messages of support, confusion, pity, and gossip, hundreds of them. Her name, already familiar to many through her hospital's community outreach work, now trended online under hashtags she hadn't asked for. A video clip had surfaced of the precise moment Ryan stepped back from the altar and shattered their future. Strangers on the internet now knew her humiliation more intimately than some of her own family did. She didn't say goodbye to many people. Lily and Michelle helped her carry the last bags to the car. Her father hugged her for a long time, his voice shaking as he whispered, "You don't owe anyone a version of yourself you had to apologize for." Her mother, already holding back tears, kissed her on the forehead and said, "Go somewhere you can breathe." So she did. Emma drove for hours, past farmlands and empty gas stations, through early morning fog and fading stars. She didn't check her phone. She didn't listen to music. She just drove, heading south until the terrain grew flatter and familiar. Late in the afternoon, she arrived at the edge of a quiet town, nestled between rolling fields and forgotten roads. The town where her grandmother lived. It was a place that smelled of rain-soaked earth and fresh bread, where windows stayed open and no one ever locked their doors. Emma had spent many summers here as a child, riding bikes barefoot and feeding stray cats that gathered near the porch. Her grandmother's house, a white two-story structure with green shutters and a sagging porch swing, stood like a memory untouched by time. The old woman opened the door before Emma could knock. She had seen the car coming and knew exactly what had brought her granddaughter home. Without a word, she embraced Emma, holding her tightly with arms that had known loss and healing. "Inside," she said softly, "you rest now." Days passed in quiet rhythm. Emma stayed away from the news, from social media, from calls she wasn't ready to answer. Her grandmother gave her space, only speaking when needed, feeding her, with warm meals and soft silences. The house became a cocoon. No questions, no judgments, no explanations. Just time. The local newspaper arrived every morning. Emma didn't open it until the 5th day, when she saw her face on the front page. The headline read, "Bride left at the altar, the viral story everyone's talking about." There was a photo, her face pale, eyes wide, mouth slightly open in disbelief. The article recounted the wedding, quoted anonymous guests, and speculated on the secrets that had caused the dramatic turn. Emma closed the paper and walked to the back porch, letting the breeze clear her thoughts. She wasn't ashamed of her past, but the way it had been twisted into something toxic was unbearable. By the end of the week, her story had spread far, beyond Ohio. National tabloids picked it up. Talk shows mentioned it. Online forums picked apart every aspect of her life, from her childhood to her social media posts. Everyone had an opinion about what she should have done, what she might have hidden and how she should move forward, but none of them knew the truth. Emma realized then that silence wasn't enough. She could disappear, yes, but that would allow the lies to fill the space she left behind. She had a voice. She had lived through something cruel and public, and that gave her two choices: remain a victim of someone else's narrative or reclaim her own. That night, Emma opened her laptop for the first time since the wedding. She drafted a post, not to defend herself, but to tell her story on her terms. She didn't mention Ryan by name, she didn't attack anyone. She simply told the truth about her childhood, about Ethan, her younger brother, about how, when their mother was hospitalized due to mental health struggles, Emma had taken legal guardianship of Ethan for nearly a year. How she had been just 21, balancing nursing school and part-time work while trying to keep their home together. She shared how difficult it had been, how much love and fear lived inside that chapter of her life, and how, until recently, she didn't think that part of her past defined her. She ended the post with one sentence: "My story is not a scandal, it's survival." She hit publish. The response was overwhelming. Within an hour, the post had been shared thousands of times. Messages poured in, not of pity but of solidarity. Nurses, single mothers, caregivers, siblings, people who had lived through something similar, all writing to say they understood, they saw her, they believed her. A journalist from a mental health advocacy site reached out for an interview. At first, Emma hesitated, but then she thought about the little girls watching the viral videos, reading headlines, hearing the cruel comments. She wanted them to know that dignity didn't come from being flawless. It came from standing back up when others tried to tear you down. She agreed to the interview. The article published 3 days later and went viral almost instantly. The journalist portrayed Emma with compassion and accuracy. Her words struck a nerve. Soon she was invited to speak at a local event focused on family care and mental health awareness. It was a small gathering, just a few dozen people in a community hall. But when she walked onto that stage and saw the faces watching her, something shifted inside her. She spoke clearly, without notes. She told her story again, not as the girl who had been left behind, but as the woman who had kept going. And when she finished, the audience stood and applauded, not for her pain, but for her strength. That night back at her grandmother's house, Emma lay in bed and finally felt something close to peace. Not because everything was resolved, not because the world had apologized, but because she had reclaimed something vital, her sense of self. She still didn't know what came next. Her job back in the city remained on hold. Her future, once so carefully planned, now lay in pieces. But for the first time since that awful moment at the altar, Emma didn't feel like she was waiting for someone else to save her. She had already started saving herself. The quiet of Emma's grandmother's house had become a kind of sanctuary. The scent of old wood, lavender, and fresh bread filled each room. Days moved slowly, wrapped in soft routines. Morning tea on the porch, tending to the garden, reading the letters people continued to send from across the country. The world outside buzzed with opinions and updates, but here, everything felt still. And yet, in that stillness, Emma's mind kept circling. One question: the accusation Ryan had hurled at her before abandoning her at the altar. He had said she wasn't honest, that she had hidden something. The crowd had gasped. Her family had been devastated, but no one had asked her directly what it was Ryan believed she had concealed. Everyone had assumed, filled in the blanks, chosen a version that fit their understanding of betrayal. But Ryan had never really known the full context himself. On a warm afternoon, Emma sat on the front steps, watching a pair of birds chase each other along the fence. Lily, who had come to stay for a few days, stepped outside and sat beside her, sipping iced tea. "He didn't deserve you," Lily said. Emma gave a small smile. "That's not the part that hurts the most." "What is then?" Emma took a long breath. "That I gave everything, that I shared so much of myself, and still, it wasn't enough. But maybe I never really told him the one thing that would have helped him understand me." Lily looked at her, waiting. "I never really explained what it was like to raise Ethan," Emma said quietly. Lily knew the basics. She had been around during part of that difficult chapter, but she had never heard it fully, not from Emma's own mouth, not with the weight it still carried inside her. Emma leaned back against the wooden post and began to speak. My mum had her first breakdown the summer I turned 21. I had just started nursing school. Ethan was 12. I remember coming home one afternoon and finding the living room trashed, my mum sobbing on the kitchen floor, talking to someone who wasn't there. The neighbors had called the police earlier, but they hadn't taken her in. I called an ambulance. That night she was admitted to a psychiatric unit. Lily reached out and took Emma's hand, but said nothing. They said it was schizophrenia. Late onset, sudden and severe. There was no one else. My dad was long gone. A couple of aunts said they couldn't take him. So I signed the papers. Temporary custody. Just until she got better. Emma stared into the distance, her voice steady but low. I thought it would be a few weeks, maybe a month. It was almost a year. I was working nights at the diner and doing clinicals during the day. Ethan was angry all the time, not at me, at the world, at her. He didn't understand why everything had changed. He didn't want to do homework. He got into fights at school. I remember trying to cook dinner while writing an essay on infection control. I burned the food, he slammed the door, and I just sat on the kitchen floor crying, wondering if I had made a huge mistake. Emma's voice cracked for a second, but she didn't stop. But I never gave up. I did the grocery shopping, paid the bills, went to parent-teacher meetings, handled every emergency. I missed out on parties, holidays, weekends. My 20s started and ended in survival mode. And when my mum finally stabilized and could come home, Ethan had changed. He was older. So was I. I never went back to being just his sister. I was something else, and I never stopped worrying. Lily squeezed her hand. Emma nodded. You were his anchor, and I never told Ryan any of it. Why not? Emma hesitated, then said, because I didn't want to be seen as someone damaged. I didn't want to carry that story into my new life. I thought if I could start fresh, I didn't need to unpack all of that. But now I see it wasn't about shame. It was about fear. Fear that if someone saw the whole picture, they wouldn't choose to stay. Lily sat with that thought for a moment, then said, would have told you everything you needed to know. But if he had known and walked away, that Emma let the truth settle deep in her chest. Later that evening, after Lily had gone back inside, Emma walked through the yard to the old shed her grandfather used to keep his tools in. She found a box tucked in the corner, labeled with her name in faded ink. Inside were old report cards, childhood photos, and near the bottom, a crumpled file folder. It held court documents, copies of the temporary custody papers she had signed, school reports from Ethan's teachers, a letter from her mother written during her recovery, thanking her for being the glue. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, the folder open on her lap, the past spilling out around her like pieces of a puzzle she had once tried to hide away. But these were not symbols of shame. They were proof of everything she had survived, everything she had carried alone. She took photos of the documents, unsure yet what she would do with them. But something told her they would matter again soon. The next day she called Ethan. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy from sleep. Hey, Em. Everything okay? Emma smiled faintly. Yeah, I just wanted to hear your voice. People at school are talking about the wedding, he said, more gently than she expected. Someone showed me the video. I almost punched a guy who laughed. Don't get yourself in trouble. Too late. She chuckled softly. I'm sorry you had to see that. I'm sorry he didn't see you, really see you. There was a pause, then he added, You saved my life. I hope you know that. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. I didn't save you, we saved each other. They spoke for a while longer, about school, about a girl he liked, about their mom's latest painting. By the time she hung up, Emma felt lighter. Not because the pain was gone, but because she had finally allowed herself to acknowledge her truth out loud. Not the curated version, the real one. And for the first time in years, she felt whole. Back in the house, she sat down at her grandmother's kitchen table with a pen and notebook. She began to write, Not for a post, not for an article, not for anyone else, just for herself. The story of that year, the hard choices, the quiet victories, the nights she stayed awake wondering if she was enough. The truth was not something to be ashamed of. It was something to build from. She no longer needed to justify her past to anyone, but she would never hide it again. The days grew cooler as September crept in, and with the change in temperature came a new kind of energy around Emma. She had settled into a rhythm in the small town, attending therapy once a week at a nearby clinic and continuing to share her story in small, curated online spaces. Messages of support still flooded her inbox, but mixed among them were a few curious ones, people claiming to know details about Ryan's circle that hadn't been publicly mentioned. At first, she ignored them. Internet strangers had already said enough, but a name kept appearing in multiple messages: Trent Hollister. Trent had been Ryan's college roommate and remained a close acquaintance throughout their adult lives. Emma remembered meeting him only a handful of times, once at a dinner party in Chicago, another at a firm fundraiser where he had made a few offhand remarks about marriage being a legal gamble. He was charismatic in the way some men are, but there had always been something clipped and rehearsed in his charm, a tone that made her watchful. Ryan never spoke much about him, and Emma never pressed. She had been too focused on their own relationship to scrutinize the people at its edges. But now those edges had begun to fray. The first message that caught her attention was from a woman named Harper, who claimed to have dated Trent briefly during law school. She wrote with care, her words cautious but determined. "I saw the video," Harper wrote. "I don't know you, but I think I know who got into Ryan's head. Trent did this to me once. He twisted something I told him in confidence and used it to manipulate someone I loved. I lost years of friendship over it. Please be careful." Emma stared at the message for a long time. She didn't reply right away. She wasn't sure she wanted to open that door. But 3 days later, another message arrived, this one from an anonymous account that linked to a comment thread on a niche legal forum. In it, users discussed rumors about Trent's past behavior, including how he had allegedly sabotaged colleagues and spread false narratives to undermine others at the firm. The details weren't verified, but the stories shared a common thread: manipulation, envy, and a need to remain in control of the narrative. Emma sat with this information for days, trying to understand what it meant. Did Trent plant the seed of doubt in Ryan's mind? Had he twisted the story about Ethan into something sinister? If so, why? She didn't want to believe that someone could be so cruel for sport. But the more she reflected, the more she remembered small, uncomfortable moments that now felt significant. The time Trent had asked her at that fundraiser whether she had ever been married before or just rehearsing. The time he had smirked when she brought up her family, asking if any of them were still around or just passing through. At the time, she had written it off as poor humor. Now it felt like something else entirely. Emma needed answers, not assumptions. She called Lily and asked if she had heard anything else about Trent since the wedding. Lily hesitated, then said she had run into an old college acquaintance of Ryan's at a coffee shop in Cleveland. According to him, Trent had always resented Ryan's successes. While Trent was brilliant, he was also known for being vindictive and territorial. Ryan had outpaced him professionally and personally, and Emma, smart, warm, loved by everyone, had only widened that gap. "So you're saying he would sabotage Ryan just to prove he could?" Emma asked. "I'm saying that," Lily replied. "He probably didn't care what the cost was, as long as Ryan fell." That night, Emma opened a blank email draft and typed out a message to Ryan. She hadn't spoken to him since their confrontation after the ceremony. She didn't know if he would respond. But the truth needed a chance to be heard. She wrote simply, "I don't know what you were told, but I know what you believed. And I think you need to ask yourself who made you believe it." She didn't send it. Not yet. Instead, she forwarded Harper's message to Lily, along with the anonymous comment thread and some screenshots she had taken of Trent's past social media posts, some of which hinted at bitterness toward Ryan's rise in the firm. One even joked, "The Golden Boy's got cracks, I just have to find the right lever." The next day, Lily forwarded Emma something else, A post from a woman named Andrea, Trent's ex-girlfriend from years ago. Andrea had published a long thread on her public account, detailing how Trent had fabricated stories about her to mutual friends after she ended things. The similarities were unsettling. "I stayed silent for a long time," Andrea wrote, "because I was afraid of how people would see me. But when I saw what he did to that woman at the altar, I couldn't be quiet anymore. He's done it before. He'll do it again. And it's time people knew." The post spread quickly. Emma watched the response unfold from her grandmother's kitchen, refreshing the page every few hours. Comments flooded in, people sharing their own experiences with manipulators, others calling for accountability. The tide was shifting, and with it came the first sign from Ryan. 3 days later, Emma received a voicemail. His voice was quiet, hesitant. "Emma, I saw the post. I read everything. I don't know what to say except, I'm sorry, I think I was wrong. I think I let someone get between us and I didn't even question it. I don't expect you to forgive me. I just needed to tell you I see it now." Emma didn't cry when she heard it. She didn't feel relief. She felt a quiet ache in her chest, not for Ryan, not for the lost wedding, but for the version of herself that had once believed love was enough to protect you from lies. She didn't call him back. Instead, she walked outside and stood under the fading afternoon sun, feeling the warmth on her face. She thought of Ethan, of Harper, of Andrea, of all the women who had carried stories too heavy to tell, and she knew what she had to do next. She would not be defined by what had been done to her. She would be defined by what she did after. She opened her laptop and started drafting a speech for an upcoming community panel on emotional resilience and recovery. She wrote about betrayal, about how some wounds are not physical but still leave scars, about how truth, when spoken bravely, can become a kind of shelter. And this time she didn't write to explain herself. She wrote to build something bigger than pain, something that could not be twisted by doubt, something that would last. Autumn deepened, painting the trees with fire and rust, and with every falling leaf, Emma shed another layer of the woman she had been before the wedding. The media frenzy that had once consumed her image had started to wane. People moved on to the next scandal, the next tragedy to dissect. But Emma was not retreating. She was evolving, and each step she took away from the wreckage of her past was deliberate and rooted in something truer than ever before. She began working again, not in the city hospital where everyone knew her face, but in a smaller clinic on the outskirts of town. They welcomed her without pretense, grateful for an experienced nurse during a season of staff shortages. The work was steady and honest, the kind of labor that kept her hands busy and her mind focused. She found solace in routines, taking vitals, comforting patients, reviewing charts, adjusting IVs. Each task reminded her of her value, not as a public figure, not as a wounded bride, but as a healer. But Emma's healing wasn't confined to medicine. One evening, while scrolling through messages on her public page, she noticed something. That sparked an idea. A woman had written, "Thank you for sharing your story. It made me feel less alone in raising my sister's kids while she's in recovery. No one talks about what it's like to carry someone else's weight when you're barely standing yourself." That sentence stayed with Emma. Later that night, sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop and a lukewarm cup of tea, she started recording a video. The lighting was soft, the background plain. She didn't wear makeup or rehearse lines. She simply spoke. "My name is Emma Collins," she began, "and a few months ago I was left at the altar. That part of the story you probably know. What you don't know is that 10 years ago, I was also a legal guardian to my 12-year-old brother, while our mother was in a psychiatric hospital. I was 21, working 2 jobs, studying full-time, and terrified. I've carried that chapter with me for years in silence. Not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't think anyone would understand." She paused before continuing, voice clear. "I was wrong. A lot of people understand. More than I ever imagined. So I'm here to talk about what happens when you've carried too much for too long, and the world still expects you to smile through it. I'm here to say it's okay to be tired. It's okay to fall apart. And it's okay to tell your truth, even if it makes other people uncomfortable. Don't." She posted the video with the caption, This is for the ones who kept going when no one saw how hard it was. By the next morning, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times. Comments flooded in, raw, emotional, grateful. Caregivers, siblings, single parents, and survivors all wrote to share their own moments of invisible strength. A support group in Pennsylvania asked her to speak at their next session. A nurse in Oregon wrote that her entire team had watched the video during a staff meeting. A teacher from Atlanta messaged to say she had played it in class to teach her students about empathy and resilience. Emma hadn't expected any of it, but she welcomed it. Each response confirmed what she was beginning to understand. Her voice had power. Not the kind of power that came from shouting or defending herself, but the kind that came from standing quietly in her truth and letting others feel safe enough to do the same. She created a weekly video series called 5 Minutes of Real. Each episode was simple and unpolished. Sometimes she talked about the guilt of not being able to save someone you love. Sometimes she shared how to support a family member with mental illness. Other times she answered questions people sent anonymously. Practical advice wrapped in gentle encouragement. She never pretended to have all the answers, but she had lived through enough to offer something rare: honesty without judgment. Soon, local news outlets picked up her story again, this time not as a scandal, but as a journey of transformation. The headlines were different now. Nurse turns trauma into advocacy, from abandoned bride to mental health champion. People started inviting her to speak at panels, school events, and webinars. And everywhere she went, she carried the same message: your past does not define your worth. How you rise after the fall does. But not everyone received her journey with warmth. One afternoon, after a particularly emotional live stream about burnout among caregivers, Emma received a message from a private account. The words were sharp and condescending. "You're milking your trauma for attention. Everyone has problems. Get over it." For a moment, it hit her in the chest. Old doubts stirred, the fear of being seen as weak, of being misunderstood. But then she thought of the countless people who had messaged her, the stories she had read, the lives she had touched, and she realized the truth. People who haven't faced your storm will always question your scars. She didn't reply to the message. Instead, she shared a quote the next day. "Some people survive quietly. Others teach from the wound. Both are brave." It became her most shared post to date. Her grandmother watched all of it unfold with quiet pride. One evening, as they sat on the porch wrapped in blankets, the older woman turned to Emma and said, "You've always been strong, but now you're not just surviving, you're leading." Emma rested her head on her grandmother's shoulder. "I never wanted this." "No," she replied. "Life can begin. But sometimes the life we planned has to break before the life we're meant to." Emma thought of those words often in the following weeks. She began planning a virtual summit for young caregivers, inviting therapists, educators, and individuals with lived experience to speak. She partnered with a non-profit that supported children of parents with mental illness. Her story had opened doors, but she refused to let it be the only focus. She wanted to build something lasting, something that would help others walk through their own fires and come out stronger. And still, beneath all the momentum, there was a quiet sadness that hadn't fully lifted. Some nights, when the house was still and the town had gone to sleep, she thought of Ryan, not with bitterness, but with the kind of distant ache reserved for things that once held promise. She wondered if he had changed, if he had learned, if he regretted the way he had chosen fear over faith. But she didn't dwell on it, because whatever answers existed in his world were no longer part of hers. Emma had found a different kind of closure, not one wrapped in apologies, but one rooted in purpose. She no longer needed someone to validate her worth. She had already done that herself. In the weeks following Emma's re-emergence as a powerful voice for caregivers and mental health advocacy, Ryan Mitchell's world unraveled with quiet precision. At first, it happened in fragments, a cancelled meeting here, an unanswered email there. But soon the cracks widened. His once well-oiled routine, built on control and reputation, began to falter under the weight of decisions he could no longer justify. But the tides turned quickly. Emma's interview with the mental health advocacy site had gone viral. Her vulnerability, tempered with grace and truth, painted a very different picture from the one the media had first assumed. Then came the revelations about Trent. Multiple women sharing stories, each more disturbing than the last, each confirming a pattern of manipulation. When Emma's followers began connecting Trent's behavior to Ryan's sudden decision at the altar, public sentiment shifted. A storm brewed around Ryan that no legal strategy could contain. First came the board inquiry at his firm. Clients had begun expressing concerns. Some had seen Emma's content and asked directly whether Ryan had played a role in her public shaming. One client, a high-profile non-profit, quietly withdrew their account, citing irreconcilable ethical concerns. When internal HR began reviewing Trent's long history with the firm, they uncovered complaints that had been ignored or buried, allegations of intimidation, passive sabotage, and one report from a junior associate who said Trent had encouraged her to spy on a colleague for leverage. That colleague had been Ryan. When confronted, Trent denied everything, but the damage was done. His name became radioactive, and by association, Ryan's credibility took a hit. Senior partners, once mentors and friends, grew distant. Ryan's cases were reassigned. His calendar, once packed with depositions and strategy meetings, suddenly felt empty. Outside the firm, the world was no kinder. He could no longer walk into a restaurant without whispers. A barista at his regular coffee shop asked if he was that guy from the wedding video. An acquaintance from law school sent a message asking if he was doing okay, but followed it with a screenshot of Emma's speech and the caption, "She's outgrown all of us." Ryan began avoiding social media entirely. Every scroll felt like walking barefoot through broken glass. Emma's face appeared again and again, not in accusation, but in triumph. She wasn't dragging him through the mud. She was simply telling the truth, and her truth exposed everything he had tried to hide behind silence. At night, he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down harder with each hour. He replayed the wedding in his mind over and over, the walk down the aisle, her face full of hope, his own hands shaking not with conviction but with confusion. He remembered the conversation with Trent just days before, that moment when doubt first took root. "She didn't tell you everything," Trent had said, voice casual but laced with suggestion. "Marrying someone with secrets. Might want to. Ask yourself why." Your Ryan had asked no questions. He had simply believed. He had let fear win. He had chosen public cowardice over private conversation. And now no amount of regret could reverse that choice. One afternoon, Ryan sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, television on mute. He held a photo in his hands. One of him and Emma taken the previous winter. They were at a cabin, bundled in sweaters, cheeks flushed with cold. She was laughing, head tilted back, eyes shining. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at her. He had loved her. Of that he was certain. But he had never truly protected her, not from others, not from himself. He had failed her, in the most public way possible, and had not once attempted to make it right. He had watched her walk down the aisle, then watched her walk away, and had said nothing. He picked up his phone and opened the message thread with her. No messages had been exchanged since his single voicemail. The silence between them was now too long, too cold, and too deserved. Still, he typed a message. "I saw your latest video. It was beautiful. You are everything I was too blind to see. I'm sorry I didn't fight for you. I hope you know that none of this was ever your fault." He didn't hit send. He deleted it. Ryan had begun seeing a therapist, a decision prompted more by the insistence of his sister than any personal clarity. The sessions were difficult. The therapist asked questions he didn't want to answer, exposed parts of him that felt too raw. But slowly he began to recognize patterns, how he had been conditioned to see vulnerability as weakness, how his fear of being perceived as naive had shaped his every decision. He admitted finally that he had not left Emma because she had done anything wrong. He had left because someone suggested she might not be perfect, and that alone had been enough to break his trust. That realization nearly broke him. He spent hours writing in a journal, something his therapist encouraged. He wrote letters to Emma he never sent. He wrote about the pressure to be flawless, the fear of failure, the shame of being seen as someone who could be manipulated. He wrote about how much he missed her, Not just her presence, but her clarity, her laughter, the way she made everything feel grounded. One evening during a quiet walk through the city park, Ryan sat on a bench and listened to a nearby street musician playing a slow, aching melody. He closed his eyes and thought of what Emma might be doing at that exact moment. Perhaps filming one of her videos, maybe speaking at another event, or simply sitting on a porch wrapped in a blanket, watching the leaves fall. He knew he couldn't undo the past. He knew he no longer had a place in her present, but he hoped somehow that she had found peace. And as the wind picked up, scattering golden leaves across the pavement, Ryan made a quiet vow to himself, not to return to the man he had been, but to become someone worthy of forgiveness, even if it never came. Because some mistakes cannot be rewritten, but they can still be the beginning of something better. The first cold winds of November swept through the small town like a reminder that seasons changed whether one was ready or not. Emma woke each morning earlier than she used to, not out of anxiety, but out of purpose. Her days began in quiet reflection, followed by hours of planning, writing, and recording. The virtual summit she had envisioned months earlier was now taking shape with momentum she hadn't expected. Speakers confirmed daily, sponsors reached out, and emails poured in from people wanting to attend, to listen, to belong. One morning, while sorting through the mail that had been forwarded from her apartment in Chicago, she found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a letter, handwritten with small, careful strokes. "Dear Emma, you may not remember me, but I was your patient 3 years ago in the cardiac recovery ward. I was terrified, angry, and alone. You were the nurse who sat with me when I couldn't stop crying in the middle of the night. You didn't just give me medicine. You told me that surviving wasn't just about fixing the heart. It was about remembering why it beat in the first place. I watched your video last week. I recognized your voice before I recognized your face. And I just wanted to say thank you for that night and for this one." Emma read the letter twice, then a third time. Her hands trembled as she folded the page and held it to her chest. She had often wondered, through the noise and chaos of the months following the wedding, whether her presence in the world made any difference. This letter, quiet, anonymous, unexpected, was a whisper of affirmation. She shared the letter during her next video, omitting the sender's name. The story struck a chord with her audience, reminding people that even the smallest kindness could ripple out in ways they might never see. Within hours, the clip had been shared by several advocacy groups and featured on a national wellness blog. But that wasn't the only surprise the day would bring. Later that evening, as Emma prepared for an upcoming Q&A, she received a message from a name she hadn't thought about in weeks: Andrea, Trent's former girlfriend. Andrea had been one of the first to publicly speak out about Trent's manipulation. But this time, she wasn't writing about her own story. "I thought you should know," the message began, "that I've been contacted by someone else." Her name is Marlene. She used to date Trent's older brother and was close to their family. She's kept quiet for years but saw your latest video and decided she couldn't anymore. She has proof, emails, recordings, things Trent said about sabotaging people's careers, Ryan's included. He bragged about knowing just how to plant the right idea, then letting people destroy themselves. Marlene is willing to go public. Emma read the message slowly. It was not vindication she sought, but truth, raw, clean truth, had always had its own gravity. A few days later, Marlene published a thread online with screenshots of messages between her and Trent, some dating back 5 years. In one, he wrote, "You want to ruin a relationship? You don't need to lie. Just show up with a seed of doubt and let insecurity do the rest." In another, he described Ryan as smart but scared, easy to push if you hit the right nerve. He referred to Emma only once, calling her the nurse with a savior complex. The thread exploded. News. Outlets picked it up. Trent issued a statement through a lawyer denying any intent to harm anyone, but the damage had already been done. He was suspended from his firm pending a formal investigation. The legal community, once quiet about his behavior, erupted with accounts from others who had long been afraid to speak. And through it all, Emma remained quiet. Not silent but intentional. She did not gloat, she did not retaliate. Instead, she returned to her message that healing came not from punishment, but from transparency. And in one of her most shared videos yet, she said simply, "Let truth do what vengeance cannot. It frees." Meanwhile, Ryan remained absent from public view. Though several reporters reached out to Emma for a comment about the growing controversy, she declined all interviews. Not because she lacked something to say, but because she knew her story no longer belonged in the same conversation as his downfall. Her life had grown beyond the frame of that betrayal, and as it grew, so did the summit. The official date was set for mid-January, and registration doubled with each passing week. Emma had brought on volunteers to help with coordination. One of them, a young woman named Carmen, confessed during their second meeting that she had found Emma's first video while recovering from a suicide attempt. "Seeing you talk about carrying your brother," Carmen had said, her voice trembling, "feel like I wasn't just this broken thing, like I could matter again." Made me. Emma hugged her. No words needed. That night, she reflected on how far she had come, from the lonely drive away from the altar to this new path lit by the stories of strangers and the fire of her own voice. And for the first time in what felt like years, she allowed herself to think about what she wanted next. Not just for others, but for herself. She started writing again, not just for videos or speeches, but for something bigger, a book. She didn't have a title yet, but the chapters began taking shape in her mind, each one a thread woven through her own unraveling and restoration. Not a memoir of pain, but a declaration of resilience. One evening, as she finished outlining the third chapter, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the hospital where she had worked in Chicago. "We saw your work online. We're proud of you. If you're ever ready to return, there's a place for you here." Emma smiled, grateful, but knew she wasn't going back. That chapter was closed. She had outgrown the walls that once confined her. She replied with a thank you, then turned her attention back to her laptop. She opened the document and typed the opening sentence of her preface. "I was left at the Elta, but that's not where my story ends. It's where it finally begins." And in that quiet room, as winter whispered outside the window, the pieces of her life, shattered, scattered, misunderstood, began to fit together again. Not as they once were, but as something stronger, something unbreakable. Snow began to settle across the small town in delicate waves, blanketing rooftops and trees in white. The roads shimmered under the thin coat of frost, and the days seemed to contract into smaller, quieter hours. Emma found comfort in the silence of winter. The summit was only weeks away, and most of her time was now devoted to final logistics, rehearsals, and calls with speakers. She moved through her days with purpose, but the nights often pulled her into reflection on the woman she had become and the path that had shaped her. She hadn't seen Ryan since the wedding. Their worlds had separated completely, orbiting different causes, different purposes. Emma had seen his name in an article once, a brief mention about the internal review at his firm, paired with a vague acknowledgement of past associations under scrutiny. She had not reached out. She hadn't needed to. The quiet distance between them had felt right, like a closing door, no longer painful, but necessary. So when she received the invitation to speak at a community health conference in St. Paul, she accepted without hesitation. She didn't know that Ryan would be there. She didn't even think of the possibility. The conference was small but meaningful, hosted by a regional alliance of health professionals and social workers. Her keynote was scheduled for the second day, and she arrived early to walk through the venue, review her slides, and meet the panelists. The atmosphere was warm despite the cold outside, with coffee stations on every corner and people greeting each other like family. Emma found comfort in the sense of shared mission. Her panel was on the third floor overlooking a snowy courtyard. As she walked toward the breakout room to prepare, she passed a series of booths, organizations, publications, support services. One display featured mental health initiatives in corporate environments. She slowed down to glance at a familiar logo. It was from the law firm where Ryan had worked. She felt her breath catch, a flicker of something too complex to name. Then she heard it, his voice unmistakable in its deep cadence, though slightly softer than she remembered. And the biggest failure was silence. We allowed a culture of performance to overshadow a culture of care. Emma turned. Ryan stood at the side of the booth speaking to a small group. He hadn't seen her yet. He looked different, more tired perhaps, but also more open. His posture was less rigid. He wore no tie, only a navy sweater under a blazer. He gestured gently, as if careful not to overstep. As she watched, one of the listeners asked a question. Ryan responded with humility, not the old bravado she had once mistaken for confidence. Emma didn't move, not at first. She was unsure what she felt, not anger, not fear, just a strange, surreal sense of stepping into a memory that had changed shape in her absence. He turned and saw her, their eyes met. There was no jolt, no cinematic pull across the room, just stillness, recognition. He blinked, lowered his hands, and gave a small, uncertain nod. Emma returned it, her expression unreadable. She turned away and continued walking toward the panel room. She thought he might follow. He didn't. The day unfolded in a blur of panels, questions, and applause. Her keynote was received with warmth, and afterward, attendees approached to thank her, to share stories, to ask advice. She stayed composed through it all. It wasn't until late afternoon in the quiet of the speaker lounge that she saw him again. He stood at the entrance, waiting. "May I?" he asked, voice low. She nodded. He stepped inside. They stood facing each other for a moment, surrounded by empty chairs and untouched coffee cups. No one else was there. "I didn't expect to see you here," he said. "Neither did I." "You look well." Emma didn't reply. She sat, folding her hands in her lap. "Why are you here?" "The firm invited me back after everything with Trent came to light. Not to the same position, but to lead internal reform. I almost said no. Then I realized maybe I owe it to the people I failed." Emma looked at him. "Including me?" He nodded. "Especially you." A beat of silence passed. "I didn't come to ask for forgiveness," he said, without the noise of headlines or cameras. "I came because I needed to tell you something." She waited. "I believed the wrong person. I let doubt dictate my actions. I thought I was protecting myself, but I was just running from something I didn't want to understand. You deserved a conversation, not a spectacle. I know that now." Emma kept her eyes on him, without asking a single question. "You humiliated me. You didn't just walk away, you condemned me." "I did," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "and I will regret it for the rest of my life." Emma looked away, her gaze settling on a poster taped to the wall. Healing. There's not forgetting, it's choosing to live differently. She let out a slow breath. "I've spent the past few months building something real, for people who don't get second chances, for people who are told their stories aren't worth telling, and I've done it without needing you to understand." "I do understand. Now," he said, "everything I wasn't. And I see what you've created. It's powerful. It's honest." Emma stood. She walked to the window, watched the snow fall in silent spirals. "I don't hate you," she said. Ryan looked down. "That's more grace than I deserve." She turned to face him again. "I'm not saying this to comfort you. I'm saying it because I'm tired of carrying pain that isn't mine. I'm moving forward. I'm choosing to be whole without needing an apology to complete the picture." He stepped closer, but not too close. "If you ever need anything, resources, support, a connection, I'm here, quietly, no expectations." Emma nodded. "Thank you." He took a slow breath. "I hope your summit is everything you imagined." "It already is." He lingered a second longer, then turned to leave. At the door, he paused. "Goodbye, Emma." She didn't say it back. She watched him go, not with bitterness, but with the steady resolve of someone who had already said goodbye in her own way, long before this moment. The snow outside kept falling, soft and endless, as if the world itself had decided to let the past be buried in something pure. Emma stood at the window for a while longer, then picked up her notes and walked to the next room. There were still stories to tell, and hers was no longer one of loss. In the weeks that followed, the virtual summit launched to overwhelming success. Over 12,000 participants logged in across the 3-day event. Sessions on trauma-informed care, family resilience, and caregiver burnout struck deep chords, sparking discussions in chat rooms and forums that went on long after the speakers logged off. Emma's opening keynote set the tone, a personal yet universal message about turning pain into power. Her words echoed through each session, shared again and again across social platforms and advocacy sites. By the summit's close, Emma had not only established herself as a speaker, but as a leader in the space she had entered almost by accident. The non-profit organizations that had partnered with the summit reached out for further collaboration. Her inbox overflowed with invitations from universities, mental health coalitions, community centers. It was as if the world had been waiting for her voice, and now that it had found it, it wouldn't let go. But amid all this external success, something unexpected began to take shape, something quiet, gentle, and deeply personal. Daniel Mercer had been covering Emma's journey since the beginning. A journalist and editor at a digital platform focused on human stories, he had first written about her viral video in a piece titled "The Nurse Who Rewrote Her Ending." The article had gone viral not just for its content, but for the care with which it had been written. It was clear that Daniel hadn't just reported the facts, he had understood the heart behind them. Emma had reached out to thank him months ago, and from there, their correspondence had grown. At first, it was professional. He asked follow-up questions, requested interviews, shared links to similar advocacy work. But over time, their emails had shifted into something else. Longer messages, curious questions, shared frustrations, and small moments of vulnerability. After the summit, Daniel invited Emma to Seattle for an in-person interview, this time for a documentary series his platform was producing on modern resilience. She hesitated. The idea of flying across the country, of entering a new and unpredictable chapter, stirred something in her chest, an excitement she wasn't ready to name. Still, she accepted. Seattle in February was rain-washed and windblown, with low skies and streets that shimmered under mist. Emma stayed in a small hotel near the waterfront. The day of the interview, she arrived at the studio early, nerves buzzing quietly under her skin. Daniel greeted her at the door. He was taller than she remembered from the photos, but there was a familiarity in his smile that made her shoulders ease. His presence wasn't overwhelming or performative. He didn't try to fill the silence. He simply welcomed her, offered her coffee, and began the setup with calm professionalism. The interview itself was intimate without being invasive. He asked about the summit, about her goals, about the quiet moments no one sees behind public work. Then, after the cameras stopped, they sat across from each other in the editing room and talked for hours about life, about burnout, about what it means to be a woman whose identity has been shaped by crisis, and how hard it is to believe in joy after surviving grief. They talked until the janitor gently reminded them the building was closing. They met again the next day, and the day after that. By the end of the week, Emma didn't want to leave. Daniel walked her to her hotel, and at the door they paused. He didn't reach for her. He simply looked at her with that same steady gaze he always had, like he saw the whole of her, not just the image the world admired. "I don't want to be just another chapter in your recovery," he said softly. Emma smiled. "Then don't be." She flew back to Ohio with her heart in an unfamiliar state, unguarded, but not unwise. She didn't rush anything. She didn't define it, but she allowed it. Over the next 2 months, Daniel visited her twice. She returned to Seattle once. Their connection deepened slowly, built not on fantasy or adrenaline, but on truth. They spoke openly, with the kind of honesty born from surviving past betrayals. Daniel never shied away from Emma's story. He didn't glorify it, nor did he avoid it. He saw her fully, messy, brilliant, healing, and met her there without flinching. One evening in early spring, as they walked through a local park in Ohio, he reached for her hand. The air was cool, the trees still bare from winter. Emma squeezed his fingers and leaned into his side. "Are you scared?" he asked. "Terrified," she said, then laughed. "But not of you. Just of believing again." He nodded. "I don't want you to forget what you've survived. I just want you to remember it doesn't have to happen again." Emma stopped walking and turned to face him. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me," she said. Daniel nodded. "And I'm not here to fix you." There was no grand declaration, no fireworks, just two people standing in the soft light of evening, understanding each other, choosing quietly to try. Weeks later, Emma received an offer to relocate to Seattle and lead a national initiative on family care and mental health policy. The organization behind the summit wanted her at the helm. It meant leaving her small town, her grandmother's house, the familiar quiet of recovery. It meant stepping fully into the life she had created, but on a larger scale. She said yes. Her grandmother hugged her tightly, teary but proud. "Destroy," she whispered. "Now go and build it even bigger." "You built a life out of what?" They tried to. Emma packed her things in slow stages, each item wrapped not in sadness but in gratitude. The porch swing, the tea mugs, the stack of letters. They were not relics. They were reminders of how far she had come. On her last morning before the move, Daniel met her at the airport. As they stood at the gate, he pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket. "This isn't a proposal," he said, smiling. "Not yet. But it's a promise." Inside was a simple note. "Let's build something honest, day by day, no timelines, no perfect stories, just truth." Emma folded the note, placed it in her carry-on, and kissed him gently on the cheek. "I'm ready." And as she boarded the plane, leaving behind the place where her life had broken open, she felt not fear, but clarity. She was not starting over. She was moving forward, with eyes wide open, heart intact, and a future built not on the ruins of what was lost, but on the strength of what she had created. Spring bloomed differently in Seattle. The rain never truly stopped, but it softened into a rhythm, a quiet drizzle that kissed the sidewalks and hung like breath in the air. Emma found the city to be both vast and intimate. Each neighborhood held its own personality. Bookstores tucked into corners, cafes lined with journals and poets, parks that welcomed long walks and longer silences. Her new apartment was modest, but bright, with windows that opened to treetops and the distant hum of downtown life. The boxes from Ohio were mostly unpacked now. Her grandmother's tea set rested on a small shelf. Her books, full of underlined passages and turned corners, lined the wall opposite her writing desk. Ethan's photo from his high school graduation stood next to a note he had written that read, "Thank you for never giving up on me." Emma's work had taken on a new shape. She led a multidisciplinary team focused on national family care support, combining policy research with public advocacy. Her days were full of meetings, planning sessions, community outreach, and recording interviews. But unlike the chaos that once ruled her life, there was balance now. Daniel remained close, not as a shadow to her journey, but as a steady presence, walking beside her. Their relationship grew not in haste, but in mutual understanding, one conversation at a time. And yet, there was still one part of her story that remained unfinished. Ryan. Though their encounter at the conference had given her a sense of closure, it hadn't addressed the full weight of what had been left behind. The pain he caused had reshaped her life, but not every scar had faded. Emma believed in healing, but also in accountability, and sometimes healing required the courage to face what had once felt unbearable. She had not initiated contact. But 2 weeks after her move, Ryan reached out again, not through a cryptic message or a voicemail, but a proper letter sent to her work address. The envelope was simple. Inside, his handwriting was familiar but more restrained, as though every word had been measured. "I don't know if this will find you at a good time," the letter began, "but I hope it finds you at all," he continued, describing the internal reckoning he had undergone, not as a plea for forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement of harm. He wrote about therapy, about learning to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it. He admitted that for A long time he saw relationships as contracts, terms to be honored or broken. Emma, he wrote, had challenged that. She had shown him what it looked like to love without condition, and he had failed to meet her with the same depth. "I would never ask to return to your life," he wrote. "More time. Not as closure, but as clarity. For both of us. But I would ask, if you're willing, to meet one." Emma read the letter twice, then placed it beside her journal. She didn't answer immediately. She let days pass, feeling for the truth in her reaction. There was no anger, no longing, only a sense that something important had yet to be spoken aloud. She agreed to meet. They chose a neutral space, a greenhouse cafe perched above the city. Emma arrived early, chose a corner seat near the windows, and watched as mist rolled in from the water. Ryan arrived 5 minutes later, dressed plainly in a grey sweater and dark jeans. He looked thinner, more serious, but also more present than she remembered. There was no awkwardness in the greeting. Just two people who once shared a future, now sitting across from each other with nothing to protect and nothing to hide. "Thank you for coming," he said. Emma nodded, stirring her tea. Silence to be the last thing between us. "I wasn't sure I would. But then I realized I didn't want the." Ryan took a breath, his hands folded on the table. "There's nothing I can say that will undo what I did. I know that. I've replayed that day more times than I can count, trying to understand how I convinced myself that walking away was noble. It wasn't. It was cowardice." Emma listened without interrupting. "I let someone else plant doubt in me," he continued. "But I didn't need to believe it. I didn't have to act on it. You gave me your trust, and I treated it like a liability instead of a gift. That's on me." She set her cup down. "I don't need an apology anymore. What I needed was for you to see the whole picture, not just of me, but of what love requires. It's not certainty. It's not safety. It's faith. You didn't lose me because I had a past. You lost me because you didn't believe I was enough to stay for." Ryan's eyes glistened. "You're right, and I carry that truth every day." Emma leaned back, letting the weight of his words settle in. She didn't feel triumphant, only still. "I'm in a different place now," she said. "I've found something good, and I'm building something honest. I don't want to look back with bitterness. I want to look back and know that I faced every wound, every shadow, and didn't let it define me." Ryan nodded. "I'm glad you're happy." They sat in silence for a while, the cafe around them alive with quiet conversations and the sound of rain tapping against the glass. When they finally stood, it was without drama, without lingering touches or final confessions. They walked together to the door. Outside, the city breathed with grey skies and wet pavement. Ryan offered a small smile. "Goodbye, Emma." "This time," she said it back. She watched him walk away, his figure shrinking into the mist. Then she turned and began walking in the opposite direction, toward the station, toward the life she had chosen, toward the man who waited for her at home with dinner half prepared and jazz playing softly in the background. That evening, Emma stood by the window of her apartment, wrapped in a sweater, sipping chamomile tea. Daniel joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. She leaned into him, grounding herself in the quiet safety of the moment. "Did it help?" he asked. She nodded. "It didn't change anything, but it reminded me that I have changed." He kissed the side of her head. "That's all that matters." Outside, the rain continued to fall, but inside there was warmth, laughter, and music. Emma no longer measured her life by what she had lost. She measured it by what she was becoming. By early summer, Emma had fully settled into her life in Seattle. The city no longer felt like a chapter in transition, but the beginning of a new book, one written with intentionality, courage, and self-respect. Her days were punctuated by routine, but not the kind that dulled her spirit. Mornings began with walks to the small park near her apartment, where the scent of blooming jasmine mixed with the sound of children laughing and street musicians playing familiar songs. Afternoons were filled with work, policy meetings, workshops, interviews, and content planning for her growing online platform. Evenings were hers and Daniel's, quiet dinners, shared books, conversations on the balcony as the sun disappeared behind the Olympic mountains. But through it all, something larger had taken root, an idea that had been growing slowly inside her since the day she read that anonymous thank you letter from a former patient. It had started as a seed, watered by every message, every panel discussion, every late-night comment from someone halfway across the world who found strength in her voice. That seed was a book. It wasn't just a memoir, it wasn't a self-help guide either. It was a story, her story, not written from a place of bitterness, but from resolve. A tapestry of memory, choice, consequence, and growth. It spoke of the girl who once believed love required silence, the woman who learned that dignity was not something others gave, but something she had always carried, even when she forgot. She titled it, At the Altar of Truth. It took her 6 months to write, another, 2 to revise, and endless internal wrestling to let it go into the world. When the publisher announced its release, they weren't prepared for the response. Pre-orders flooded in. Interview requests came from all over, news channels, podcasts, university circles. But Emma, true to herself, chose only those platforms, where the focus remained on healing and collective truth, not gossip or spectacle. On launch day, she stood in the back of a small bookstore on Capitol Hill, surrounded by friends, colleagues, and strangers who had followed her journey from the very beginning. Ethan flew in from college for the event, now taller and more grounded than ever, a living reminder of the resilience they both shared. Her grandmother sent a video message from Ohio, shown on a small projector screen before Emma took the mic. Emma didn't prepare a long speech. She didn't need one. I was left at the altar, she began, but that wasn't the end of my story. It was the point at which I finally saw myself clearly, not as a victim, not as a woman scorned, but as someone who survived, adapted, and stood back up. And that's what this book is, a record of falling and choosing to rise. Applause followed, not thunderous but heartfelt. She signed books for over 2 hours that evening, taking time with each person, many of whom offered more than gratitude. They shared pieces of their own lives. A teacher who had left an abusive marriage, a teenager caring for a parent with bipolar disorder, a nurse who had hidden her burnout for years. Emma listened to every story, not as a figure on a pedestal, but as one of them. Weeks later, At the Altar of Truth reached the bestseller list. The impact rippled far beyond charts or sales. Reading groups formed around it. University programs included it in curricula on trauma recovery and caregiving ethics. Mental health. Nonprofits used it as a resource for peer mentorship programs, but perhaps the most meaningful response came in the form of letters. Thousands of them, handwritten, emailed, typed in long blocks of text, from people across the country and some beyond it. Each one a testament to the fact that Emma's voice had reached places where silence once reigned. Stories of isolation, courage, rediscovery. Some wrote to say her story gave them language for their own. Others said it gave them permission to forgive themselves. One letter came from Ryan. It was brief, a single page. He wrote that he had read the book twice and that it had hurt, but in a necessary way. He thanked her for her honesty, her grace, and for writing without malice. He said he now understood the difference between regret and responsibility. Emma placed that letter in a drawer. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Months passed, and Emma's work continued to grow. She launched a mentorship initiative for young adults, caring for family members with chronic illness or mental health struggles. She partnered with therapists, educators, and peer leaders. The program grew state by state, each chapter supported by volunteers inspired by her journey. Her platform remained intimate, grounded in her values. She posted weekly reflections, never chasing trends, only sharing what felt sincere. She often ended her posts with the phrase, "Your story is still unfolding. Let it." Daniel remained by her side, their relationship deepening in quiet, beautiful ways. There were no grand announcements or social media showcases, just mutual respect, long walks, thoughtful conversations, and laughter. So much laughter. They spoke of the future sometimes, not in blueprints but in brushstrokes. Shared space, shared work, shared time. On the anniversary of the day she had been left at the altar, Emma hosted a small event for her non-profit, not to commemorate the hurt, but to celebrate the community that had risen from it. She stood on a modest stage in a converted library, reading the final passage from her book. There was a day I believed my story had ended in front of an altar, under the gaze of too many eyes, with silence pressing like stone against my chest. But I was wrong. That day was not an ending. It was the moment I learned that breaking is not the same as being broken. And in the breaking, I found the one person I had forgotten to believe in, myself. The room was silent, reverent. Then, applause warm and sustained. As the evening wound down, a young girl approached her, no older than 12. She held the book in both hands, too big for her frame, her voice trembling. My mom read this with me. She said, "You're the bravest person she's ever seen." Emma knelt so they were eye to eye. "I think your mom might be the brave one." The girl nodded, shy but proud. Emma signed her book and sent her off with a hug. That night, back home, Emma sat by the window, a soft breeze slipping through. The open glass. Daniel brought her tea. She rested her head against his shoulder. No words were exchanged. There was nothing more to say. She had told her story, and it had become so much more than her own.